And that's you live. We'll just give it a wee second while the YouTube feed catches up to the website.
Right, hello everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Jessica Gaetan Johannesson and I'm absolutely delighted to be hosting our event tonight. We're here to talk about personal narratives made public, and it's just funny. I feel like I've been privy to, have witnessed so many conversations around this theme lately, and it's also a subject that I'm just personally very interested in. It's a huge pleasure to welcome two writers who've each very bravely and generously shared of their lives and their craft in two recent books. And they've done so with an endless sense of inquiry, I think. And I'm going to introduce those two writers and then just run through quickly what the evening will look like. So first of all, I'm very, very happy to welcome Alice Hattrick. A little bit of information about Alice. So Alice's criticism and interviews have appeared in publications such as Frieze Magazine, Art Review, and The White Review. Their work has most recently been included in Whitechapel Documents of Contemporary Art and Mind Searching Yours. They are the co-producer of Access Docs for Artists, a resource for disabled and or chronically ill artists, curators, and writers, which is made in collaboration with artists Leah Clements and Lizzie Rose. In 2016, they were shortlisted for the Fitzcarraldo Essay Prize, and Ill Feelings is their first book, which we'll be talking about tonight, which is this wonderful mix of memoir, analysis, literary criticism, mainly around the exploring experiences of living with chronic illness. Welcome, Alice. It's an absolute joy to have you here. We've also got Melissa Febos, who is the author of Whip Smart, Abandon Me, which was a Lambda Literary Award finalist and Publishing Triangle Award finalist, and the collection Girlhood, a national bestseller and Lambda Award finalist, and winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism. And now most recently, Bodywork, the Radical Power of Personal Narrative, which looks like this, at least in the UK, looks differently in the US. Bodywork is an indie next pick and national bestseller. She's a recipient of awards and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, Lambda Literary, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, the Barbara Denning Foundation, MacDowell, and others. Melissa is also an associate professor at the University of Iowa. Thanks so much for joining us, Melissa. I always feel like I want to clap, but we are clapping, in our minds or whatever. So just a few words about the way that the evening will work. We're going to start with two readings, actually, just to get a sense of these two different books and what they're about, and their books' personalities and what kind of worlds we're inhabiting in them. And then we will talk about, we'll have a conversation followed by questions. So those of you who are watching at home, you're very, very welcome to put your questions in the chat on the website, and those will get fed through to us and we'll pick them up at the end. I will read your questions out. So whenever anything comes up, feel free to pop that in the chat box. You don't have to wait till the end to actually ask your questions. All right, thank you so much. So I think we'll start with a reading, and just because you're sort of next to me on my screen, Alice, are you okay starting?
Yeah, definitely. That's fine.
Thank you.
All right. Right. So I'm going to read a little section from quite early on in the book. So there's not much that you've kind of missed, basically. This is kind of quite it's quite early. And it's a section called Basically Furious. My mother does not have a letter from the Children's Hospital confirming my ME/CFS diagnosis, but she does have letters she wrote to doctors and services asking for help. She also has all the appointment cards and the letters relaying negative and normal test results and the responses to her pleas. She keeps them all in a folder labeled Alice, Health. She calls it my health archive. Alice gets exhausted very easily, my mother wrote to one consultant. Alice does not sleep easily, but has never been a good sleeper. She gets an ill feeling in her chest region when she is exhausted. We just go from crisis to crisis with Alice, my mother wrote to the local child and adolescent mental health service. As a mother, when you feel ill and your child feels ill, your instinct is to ask, what has caused these ill feelings? You think it might be something in your blood, or your bones, or your brain, or your lungs. It could be a pesticide in the air, or a chemical in the products you use, a parasite, a dormant infection. If there is nothing wrong with your blood or your bones, your brain or your lungs, if all the tests come back negative or normal, that means you as mother and daughter are made to feel like you are bad for each other. From the outside, this kind of influence can seem dangerous. Sometimes it is impossible to find an origin for ill feelings. I had contracted Giardia age 2, and my mother says I verbalized my persistent symptoms from when I could first speak. But it seems my ill feelings were all read through my mother's. They even sounded like the symptoms of atypical pneumonia, the trigger for her chronic illness. It was as if I had watched and learned how to be ill from my mother. The doctors wrote back to her, and she has kept those letters too. They referred to me as if I was another symptom of my mother's confounding ill health. A letter from an ME specialist in London to my mother's GP confirming her original diagnosis also refers to her remaining concern for her daughter Alice, who has some difficulties in adjustment and has anxieties and a variety of symptoms that superficially resemble those that her mother has. Another letter addressed to my mother reads, my interest in the matter being her concern for my ill health, would be on the basis of a general wish for your situation to be helped by improving hers. The specialist writes of the unclear extent to which my symptoms reflect the common use of the common symptom language with my mother, which she refers to as a familiar element in chronic fatigue syndrome, and asks whether these symptoms are in fact a way of expressing my distress or difficulties. I found a copy of this letter in a pile of papers relating to my mother's own ill health, on which she had written the phone number for the 90s television show Changing Rooms, and a note to herself. Alice is angry. My anger is a common theme in my mother's letters, her amnesis of my medical history. Alice is full of anger, which is often directed at me because I am ill, my mother writes. She gets upset because she feels ill so much of the time, and she can't cope with what is expected of her. This is confirmed in a letter from my GP. On direct questioning, neither Alice nor her mother felt she had been depressed, although she undoubtedly has mood swings and has at times been low, angry, and frustrated by her illness. You were basically furious and wouldn't speak to him, my mother says to me about the doctor at the Children's Hospital who first diagnosed me with chronic fatigue syndrome in the spring of 1998. Our GP said, I needed to be ill and you were naughty, she says, as if these were our real diagnoses. She asked you to draw a picture and you refused. ME/CFS was not even my first unexplained illness. The first was called an apparent failure to thrive, another kind of refusal, all appearances and no evidence. I was naughty, but I was also ill. What did drawing a picture have to do with it? I could ask why the child my mother described in her letters was so angry, but I am more interested in the question of what constituted that anger, or what seemed to be enacted in its expression. Our diagnosis and the symptom language we spoke contain the histories of 2 centuries of gendered illness. It was as if that history was inside our actual bodies. As Adrienne Rich wrote in 1969, my politics is in my body, accruing and expanding with every act of resistance and each of my failures. Locked in the closet at 4 years old, I beat the wall with my body and that act is in me still. Was I sick of feeling angry all day or angry at feeling sick? I always hated being told what to do. What if I wanted to stay angry, to stay basically furious? What if I still do? That's that.
Thank you so much.
Right.
It was such a nice place to end on as well, as we go over to Melissa reading from your book, Body Work. It seems like such a nice bridge.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you so much, Alice. Yeah, I thought I'm going to do that sort of inadvisable thing and read something that I've never read before from this book. I'm going to set my timer, so don't worry. But I've been reading from it a lot, and I'm glad I did, actually, because it feels a little bit in conversation with the passage you chose to read, Alice. I love that section. And, mostly I've written memoir and personal essay and sort of, auto theory, sometimes they call it here. But this book is all about writing from experience. And so I thought I might read a little bit of sort of what that meant to me as a child, and then a little section of sort of my adult practice. And this is from an essay called The Return. I remember sitting at the wood desk in my bedroom, writing poems in a thin green ledger meant, I think, for accounting. I was already an obsessive list maker and loved the orderly geometry of lined paper. An empty notebook was a promise, a stack of empty notebooks, insurance that whatever amount of language might fit inside of each lean binding, that same amount of what filled me could be organized into straight lines, packed onto a train of sense or story that moved inexorably in a single direction. Whatever chaos existed in the abstract, it could not help but submit to the perfect blue lines of the page. Secretive people are often diarists, I've noticed. Even to write unspoken words multiplies them, makes us less alone. I used notebooks as diaries from a young age, but also when I wrote stories and poems, clumsy emulations of the books I read. Even the most fabricated of these helped quell the tumult inside of me. I read madly, obsessively, an eclectic assortment of literary and young adult fiction, horror and romance novels, psychology books, and poetry. These escapes made my childhood bearable, not because I had a difficult childhood, but because childhood is difficult, powerlessness assured, trauma unavoidable, consciousness a weird and indefinable burden we have no way of contextualizing. The relief of narrative immersion, the power of externalizing and naming my own experience, the pleasures of language and creation. There was no hierarchy among these. I valued and experienced them as one. It makes perfect sense to me that they became so central to my self-conception and to my life, even at that young age. I loved stories of addiction, sexual mavericks, and madness, like I Never Promised You a Rose Garden, The Bell Jar, Tristessa, The Basketball Diaries, A Spy in the House of Love. In daydreams, I imagined myself sometimes the architect of such stories, sometimes a character in them. I'm surprised it took as long as it did for me to realize that I could be both. In books, I found an archetype that could hold my own sadness, the loneliness of consciousness, and the implicit knowledge of its furthest extremes that could even make it romantic. The role of writer was the first that suggested a way for me to fit into society, to be valued and legible to others if I were to be consumed by my least nameable hungers, as I feared. Also, that I was not alone. Poets were the first people I found who named those absurd, ugly, unbearable, and ecstatic parts of being human. They are often better named by lyric means. I'm going to skip ahead. So this is me in my mid-30s. In the spring of 2013, I was in the grip of a torturous, addictive relationship. I had made a person my higher power, and all those who have done so know its torment. It was a form of worship that held me in bondage, as all obsessions do. I thought of her all day and night and would have sacrificed almost anything to secure her love, or rather to stabilize the quaking insecurity of our attachment. I ended up sacrificing quite a lot by the end of it. Though I had not been much of a crier since childhood, I cried so often that the skin around my eyes had begun to peel in dusty flakes. One evening, near the end of a long and terrible cry, unsatisfying as all my cries were in those days, their churn repetitive as the scrape of rubber against the pothole in which it is stuck, I had a flash of inspiration. I would write the story of this, and that story would be called Abandon Me. I found an index card, scrawled the title on it, and tacked the card to my kitchen wall. No title had ever come to me like this, and none have since. It felt so clear and so certain. I understand why the Greeks assigned such moments to the will of powers beyond the self. But it was not a gift from any muse. It was an act of resilience, the result of all the ways that art had rescued me in the past. It was an intention, a decision come from deeper than my conscious mind, a wish, a prayer. Sometimes these can all be synonyms. It was a shift of heart. As embedded in that urge was the desire to leave her, to free myself, because I could not tell that story correctly without doing so. And I'll stop there. Thanks for your good attention.
Thank you so much. I feel like already in those two passages are so many of the things that, at least to me, reading your two books, were meeting points and asked questions of each other almost. And we'll move on. Language and kind of finding language for things is definitely one of them. But I wanted to start somewhere a little bit before that, maybe, which is talking about the distance needed, or the distance that even personal writing maybe creates between versions of the self, or yourself as a narrator, as an author, and the self that is on the page. So my first question, which is for you both, is what kind of distance was needed in order for you to write the books that you've just published? And yeah, maybe I start with Alice. Just put you on the spot there. That's the thing with Zoom. You just.
I think, well, for me, I was writing about my lived experience as it was happening, but also going back to a childhood version of myself. And I think a lot of that, so yeah, writing about a childhood is more like accessing a childhood self, or kind of trying to find them. Whereas I think I was, you're not really searching for the self that you are at the moment. You're kind of just, I was just kind of recording how that was kind of how I was experiencing things. So to sort of give some background, I was like seeking a diagnosis in my early 30s, having kind of been a child diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome in the 90s, and then having I've always had sort of pain and fatigue and things, but having quite a kind of like a relapse into ill health as someone in my early 30s. So I was experiencing some things that were very similar to what I was experiencing as a child in terms of my symptoms, maybe, but also in terms of encountering or like encounters with medical professionals and with medicine in general. And so I had this opportunity to kind of compare both experiences. So I had to kind of find that child who had gone through that when they were maybe 9 or 10 years old. And that I found in remnants of diaries that my mum kept. My mum keeps everything. We're quite similar, as you can probably see. I've got quite a lot of stuff as well. So it was always also kind of accessing our kind of relationship then as well, which was obviously very kind of under a lot of tension, as we were both ill and both being told by doctors that our symptoms were, we were manifesting them between us. We were kind of collaborating in making it our kind of unexplained illness, or in our kind of illness language, our symptom language that we shared. So yeah, for me, like writing or documenting my own experience at that time was very different to accessing that childhood self who I could kind of I was kind of getting to know them. And so there was two things kind of going on at the same time.
Mm-hmm. So interesting to hear you talk about it, Alice. And it just struck me, I'm going to answer your question, Jessica, but I just want to respond to what Alice said, because it's so powerful to hear you talking about sort of, I don't know, sifting through that story as an adult, because so much I'm reading your book right now. And as I'm reading it, it's so much describing how the child Alice's experience was largely narrated to other people and also to Alice by the mother character. And I hadn't quite thought of it this objectively, but you writing the book is very much one of sort of becoming the narrator of her story in a different kind of way. Really powerful. I definitely identified with what Alice said about that experience of sort of writing into the present experience of the sort of present narrator, and also sort of researching and diving into in this process of kind of getting to know and discovering that child character at the same time. That's very much my experience of writing memoir. And I will say something that I touch on in body work is how often people say, oh, I don't know, after I published my first book, people would often say, oh, you're much too young to write a memoir. Like, you don't have enough distance from these events in order to have anything interesting to say about them. And I don't think sort of, for me, there are a couple of factors. One is that I have a swiftly declining memory, probably from all the drugs I did in my 20s. But if I were to wait a very long time between experiencing something and writing about it as an adult, I would have access to so many fewer specific details and the immediacy of the emotions. And for me, the present part of my narrative is often me trying to sort of write my way through an experience, and often forge a path out of an experience by writing about it, which is one of the ways the personal narrative sort of functions for me, is that as I'm sort of constructing the narrative of what's happening, I'm able to be more honest in the writing sometimes than I am in my life. And that helps me sort of wake up to a greater truth of my experience and sort of move through it into whatever comes next. I'll also say that I've often fielded sort of responses from other people, writers or not, that this presumption that people who write personal narrative are, I don't know, very comfortable being seen, or very comfortable confronting their own experience and their own sort of painful past. And for me, it's not true. It's actually kind of the opposite, is that I'm really averse to confronting the past. And in fact, the sort of aesthetic process of making art out of it acts as a mediator that makes it more possible, because I understand that in order to sort of process the past, integrate it psychologically, I need to sort of confront it. But it's easier for me to write about it and be sort of distracted by the craft and the sort of puzzle of making art out of it, than it would be for me to even talk about it in therapy or with another person. I have the sort of utter privacy and that very consuming work of making a book.
Well, it's interesting. You earlier when you were talking about Alice's book, for example, you referred to the mother character, and this was something that was really striking in one of your essays when you talk about your experience, Melissa, of teaching creative writing, and how there seems to be this resistance to seeing the people inhabiting personal narratives as characters. And I sort of wonder, from you both, like where does that come from? Why is it so difficult to see Melissa in this, that it is a character, just like, or in some ways that we get in novels?
Yeah. I mean, I think, as writers, we spend a lot of time thinking about what a character is and have a very firsthand experience of when you try to represent someone on the page, you can only take like the tiniest little handful of characteristics and details. And we're keenly aware of everything that we have to leave out when we're representing ourselves or other people, right? But I think when you pick up a book, this experience hasn't been revisited upon me. It seems only fair that it will someday. But to pick up a book, I imagine, and read about that little handful of qualities about yourself without the larger experience of like how necessary it is to leave things out. I just imagine it must be shocking. Like, oh, wait, but there were so many things you left out. Like, that's not me, but it has my name and they're described as looking like me. So over the years, I've come to have a lot of sort of sympathy for how it must feel to see oneself represented on the page. But it's one of the first things I talk about with my students, because as long as we're wed to trying to put our whole selves or all of anyone else in our work, we'll never finish. The art will always fail because people are infinite and characters must be finite little slivers.
Yeah, absolutely. And Alice, I mean, with talking of the distance maybe between you and other people that you're writing about, you explore that so so interestingly, the dynamics of you writing about your experience or your mother having written about you to medical professionals, and now you writing about those dynamics. And I wondered if the act of writing this book had in any way kind of changed or defined your stories as more separate, or created any kind of distance between your stories of illness. Does that make sense? It's a question.
Yeah. Yeah, something I was thinking when you were speaking, Melissa, was that or like that kind of the feeling of what happens when you read your own story, or like you read you as a character in someone else's book. And I think and I don't know if she probably is not telling me the whole story of my mother. Usually, we all keep our things to ourselves as well. I think that's another thing that is essential to remember, is that the character of her is what I know of her. It's not her, like as she knows herself. So and that's the case just in real life, right? She is a character in my life in that sense, because I don't know everything about her. I don't know, I'm not in her head. But I think she feels like a sense of relief at being seen as well, and reading herself as a character, that is revelatory to and I've heard this from people who have had similar experiences to when you've never read your own experience or anything like it represented. It's quite a relief to kind of have it in a book form, or it feel like, even though I'm very interested in unofficial knowledge, it kind of feels like official because it's real in the world. And it's contributing to a literature of illness, but also just of experience. So I think even though like that potential feeling of unease or concern or being misrepresented is, and I always felt that when I was writing it too, I didn't want to misrepresent her. I didn't want to invade her privacy. But I kind of, over the years of working on it, I kind of, the way I came to think about it was that I'm always doing it out of like love. I'm doing it out of like, something more than us, the two of us. Like, it's not about, it's about us, but it's more than us. So like, you kind of, in giving my story up to, invading my own privacy or whatever, and invading hers, like, something else kind of happens in that. And we as people, like, kind of, we it hasn't really affected our lives particularly. It's not like, nothing is like substantially changed. Like, it's just the same. And I think the idea of it is maybe more scary than the reality of it. Yeah. Like, not, so some people know what I wrote in a diary when I was like 14, like like nothing bad happened. But yeah, I think it really depends what you're kind of writing about, doesn't it? Like, I'm exposing our lives in order to raise awareness, effectively like make people more aware of this these experiences that are, you know, like exposing those narratives. So part of that is having to disclose kind of personal information. But
well, that kind of touches on something else that I wanted to ask relating to that, which is the choice to write or not to write, or how to write about other people who are existing in the world. Does that in any way relate to who you're writing for? You know, who your ideal reader is, which kind of goes back to the whole, like, as an act of love as well. You know, you put it beautifully in which I was like, yes, when I was reading this, Melissa, when you say that to let the writer loose, that, you know, writing isn't always like the most important thing. Actually, people are more important, and in the service of love. So how does that relate to who you're writing for? Is my question.
Yeah, I think, you know, for me, it's I always want there to be a single rule that I can just live by and measure an ethical metric that will simplify it, so I never have to sort of sort through this again. And that's just not possible, because every time I write something, I have to sort of balance. I have to think about the ways that it is going to affect the actual people who are implicated in my story, or the people who love me, who might not be privy to the information that's necessary to the story I'm writing. And then the hypothetical reader or audience of readers who might be served by it. And also the value of telling that story and even publishing that story to me. And you know, it's tricky, because I think in order to be a person who writes books and publishes books and is a professor of writing, I have had to prioritize the art over people sometimes, and over my own discomfort or my desire to avoid discomfort sometimes. But I have sort of learned, as I have in every other area of my life, I've sort of learned where my ethical boundaries are by crossing them. And, you know, I had an experience where I wrote an essay about someone that I love, with whom I have an ongoing relationship, a family member. And, you know, I wrote about an event that was really big in our relationship, and it was also really big in their life, and it was something that primarily happened to them. And I love the work of art that I made about it. I'm really proud of that essay. I have heard from many readers that it was helpful to them, like it reached the audience I intended. And unlike most of the things I've written, I have regrets about it, because it really hurt the person that I wrote about. And the issue wasn't the point of the essay or the success of the art. It was that I took authorship in a public way of an event that was huge in their life. And that was just bigger than anything else that the work might do. Like, they didn't give a shit about the art. You know, they were just like, this wasn't yours. And I was like, it helped people. And they were like, I don't care, you know? And it really forced me to sort of redraw the line of my own boundary, particularly if it's someone that I love, who I want to protect, you know, and a relationship that I want to protect. And sometimes love is, you know, choosing that relationship over whatever good I think my work is going to do in the world. And then there's other people, like my emotionally abusive ex-girlfriend, where I'm like, I didn't write it to spite her. And I did, sort of, as Alice said, like, I truly wrote about her with love for her, more love than I have felt a lot of times since that relationship ended. But I knew that's not how she was going to read it. And she didn't, and she was furious, and it was really awkward. And that I don't regret, because it was more important to me, sort of, what that book would do in the world and the work that it did for readers, than I had no relationship to preserve with her. So it was really just sort of where I saw my own boundaries.
Oh, there's so much to talk about, but I'm actually going to move on to language, because otherwise I will miss out entire chunks that I want to ask you both about. You know, in some ways, like you talk about the unspeakable, Melissa, in your in one of your essays, and I suppose, and that word sort of made me go back to think about Alice's book and how things can be unspeakable as well for so many different reasons, be it because they are, erased, or because there are no words for them within a certain context, as in with official narratives of illness, for example. So I wanted to ask you both about the joy and the challenges of creating your own language. And starting with Alice, I wondered if, when you were, you describe it as building a language of your own at one point, and talking about your experience of illness. And I wondered, how did accessing the language of others, so the women that you write about throughout the book who also had different experiences of illness, and actually your mother's language as well, how did all those different languages help you, if at all, create your own?
Yeah, so I guess partly in early on in my kind of journey towards finding my own language, I looked for personal narrative in personal accounts of illness, of ill feelings. It's particularly around what I identified as like hysterical gendered illness, because that's how my mother and I were treated as a child and a woman in her 30s in the 90s. We were told we were hysterical, like with that exact language. So I kind of looked to late 19th, early 20th century accounts, and I tried to find them, and so that's what I was kind of exploring early on. And I kind of, I was also, writing down things that my mum was saying to me when she was talking about her own symptoms. She had her own kind of relapse like a few years before me. So I had all these notes from things that she'd said that sounded really weird, and, they didn't really make any sense. They weren't like the kind of official medical language that we use for symptoms of illness. They were things like, they were very metaphorical. They were things like being hit by a truck, or certain sensations in her chest or her ears, and things like this that made her sound like hysterical, or like they weren't kind of they didn't kind of follow that official like route, the language that she had to write in documents, like medical documents and things like this. And I also, she's very verbal, and I was always very non-verbal. Like I didn't speak in those situations. I refused to write a symptom diary, whatever that, like I was very like anti-language as a child. And so I kind of came to regard that resistance as a form of resistance, that refusal to speak as a form of resistance, because I knew, I had this sense even as a child that my account would be used against me, or my words would become weaponized, that if I spoke, I would be told that what I was saying was hysterical or was make-believe, or, you and your daughter have a hysterical symptom language. If you didn't speak, you couldn't be accused of those things. So I feel like that's how I came to understand that childhood resistance to language. And I think I had the sense as an adult that a refusal to speak, or like an inability to speak, is actually a kind of symptom of pain, or it's a result of pain. Like you can't speak pain, you can't describe fatigue, like there is no language for these things. And I just assumed that was like correct or something. And then it was only through the process of writing and through reading hundreds and thousands of words of medical literature and literature and diaries and letters and everything that could possibly be written, that it turned around in my head. So it wasn't that we don't have language if we're in pain and we're hurting and we're really tired and we're, like the pain doesn't kill your language. It's just that what you're saying, it doesn't make sense to the institution that is encouraging you to speak, or like the power structures that are against you, like within that space. Like that's what kills language. It's not your own bodily experience that kills language. It's just that what you're saying is potentially illegitimate and then also could be used against you. So there was a lot more going on for me than I first realized around language, because it really started with just like, that sounds really, my mum calling herself, like feeling like she's in an egg slicer, being sliced by an egg slicer, these things. And I was like, like, it's like a compulsion to write down what she's saying, just to record it, because there is this record, this official record of her symptoms, and then I wanted this unofficial record of her symptoms that to me said much more about how she was feeling and how she was doing. And also, if we had both of those accounts, then we have both sides of the power dynamic. Because that's the other thing about writing. Sorry, the last thing.
No, sorry. That was more like an interested.
No, don't. It's just the last thing I was going to say was about the characters as well, and like how we feel when we're writing about someone we love or whatever, or we hate or whatever. It's actually, for me, is what I'm writing against is this structural issue that oppresses us. So that's always the most important thing. And like that, all the characters and all the people, the real people, the pretend people, that is kind of almost, not shifts. It shifts for me. Like that's not really the important thing. The important thing is like how our personal experiences can actually we can kind of deconstruct that. But yeah.
That leads me to another question that I had for you, Melissa, just related to that. Like the essay that you were reading from at the beginning, The Return, you read the bit with the diaries, but there's also quite a lot about music and song lyrics in that essay. And again, that made me think about, trying to find language where there is erasure, or where there is silence, or where there is the unspeakable. I just wanted to hear more about whether music it helped you find a language for the unspeakable at all, later on in life. Or
that's interesting. What a good question. I would say certainly yes. And there was so much of what Alice was saying that just goes back to sort of the impetus for my wanting to write this book, including you've probably read it, Jessica, like really sort of drawing a parallel between sort of like contemporary biases against sort of personal writing and the sort of historical medical narrative of hysteria and the ways that it's used, or just like the example that it sets of how discredited certain stories are, particularly female stories, queer stories, trauma stories, illness stories, when they sort of, when they challenge metrics or understandings, or even just the research of men, or, people who are sort of defining what diagnoses are. Anyway, your question was not about that. Your question was about music. I was a really intense, like deeply feeling kid, as I think lots of kids are. And I remember like some of my earliest memories are of being frustrated that there was no language and seemingly no acknowledgement for huge swaths of like what being alive was. Like, just like a weird sublime experience of like being a human being in a body and having the like ephemeral experience of being embodied. And like nobody talked about that. We didn't even, there was not even any acknowledgement that we were animals. It's really weird. Humans are so bizarre. Civilization so perverse. But I feel like music was the first form of art where I recognized aspects of my own experience that weren't named in any literal way, like not in school, not at home. Like music sort of named and therefore sort of provoked like aspects of my sort of emotional self that I felt, because they weren't talked about, that I might be completely alone and feel it. I was like, is this that's going on inside of me, like going on inside of everyone else? And I heard music and I was like, yes, it is. And I think that was like my first relationship to art, was that it sort of named things that we couldn't in literal language. And I think that's true of writing too. And this goes back to some of what Alice was saying, or even just the way that sort of metaphor and analogy serve us in describing the physical sensations of pain. Like, it's really hard to name those literally, especially when people have a vested interest in not hearing it. And in some ways, I think that's where the intervention of art can be useful, because it has a way of naming things that, I don't know, can sort of pierce through the familiar narratives or the dismissed narratives, So yeah, music has always been a really big, and when I was younger, I used to sing, and that I used to love to sing really sad songs, to the chagrin of my music teacher. I only wanted to sing. She was like, opera. And I was like, Billie Holiday. She's like, okay. And I don't know, I guess I always, I wanted to be a writer even when I was a little kid, and I wanted my writing to do what music did.
Thank you. I have a final question, but I am going to sort of save that. Or I have many questions, but I have one question I definitely need to ask. But I am going to just read some of the questions in the chat first to give fellow viewers and readers a chance to get a word in. So kind of there's some of the we have touched on, but so a question from Tony, what was the most surprising response or reader you've had to your books? Mm-hmm. And yeah, whoever wants to kind of, if anything jumps up, go for it.
I have a not serious answer to this. So this isn't about this book either, but in my last, in one of my books, I described, like I've written a lot about my own childhood and like what a weird kid I was and like what was going on, the unnameable and unspeakable things that I was thinking inside my child's mind. And there's this program in the US when I was a kid, called the DARE program. It was like Nancy Reagan's like anti-drug legislation, like totally ineffectual. But there was this program where a police officer would come into our school classroom and open up this drug box, and it had all these little pills and like syringes, and it was supposed to like dissuade us. And I wrote in one of my books about how when they came in with the drug box, I was like, I'm up for any of it, and how that was like not the response that just so the viewers know, I've been clean and sober for like 18 years. So this is not my life anymore. But I once ran into my 5th grade teacher, my teacher from when I was like 10 or 11 on the streets of my hometown when I went home, and she sort of grabbed me by the shoulders and she was like, I had no idea what you were thinking when you were a little kid. What are the children thinking? And that, I would say, sort of surprising. The most surprising responses I've got to my work are from actual people who know me, readers. It's been much more sort of heartening and kind of what I hoped, but like I feel less alone and so on and so forth. But I'd say the most surprising have been from sort of people from my past that have popped up over the years.
It's hilarious. What about you, Alice? Have you had any surprising responses to your book so far?
I think, I guess having kind of strangers, or like, like strangers rather than people who know you, like personally, I guess like I've also had like messages from people that like knew me and my mum when I was a kid and when she was younger too. So and saying like, you know, it's been great to read your account of this time when I knew you then. So that's always kind of interesting as well. That yeah, even if someone was kind of there or like was around at the same time, they're also kind of interested in this kind of account. Reading it because I think these things, like, you know, we think of like illness, for example, so that's what I'm writing about, but you know, we think of that as affecting the person experiencing it, and also we think of you know, like the process of diagnosis and treatment and these things being kind of quite contained within the person that is going through them, but they have such a knock-on effect to everybody around you. And even if you don't, you know, you're not that aware, you know, that yeah, the wider circle of people still kind of are affected by those things, and so I think I hope that it does make those people kind of feel like they have more of a sense of it too. So it's kind of I wasn't really expecting that.
Maybe this is a good time for my other question that I definitely wanted to ask, which is just a bit of a like something that's been on my mind the last few weeks. And it was a while ago, I was kind of part of a discussion around, just a chat around, it was about nature writing and about women in nature writing, and how, you know, there's this argument that if you're a woman writing about the environment, that you are sort of expected to bring in your trauma and your personal story into it. And and the same thing would then apply, or a similar thing would apply to people of color and to queer people, that you are somehow expected to write about your personal experience and particularly your trauma. And I don't necessarily agree with it fully, but I think it poses a really important question. And that is, you know, what happens when the power you have in sharing your personal narrative meets the agenda of a publishing industry, and yeah, what happens in that, and how much can we hold on to our power, I suppose, is my actual question after that very long preamble. How can we keep it from being exploited is another way to answer that question.
Yeah, I don't know that we can. Sometimes we can't. You know, some people do what they do with our work after it's published to some extent. I mean, I will say that I think I have often specialized in writing work that sort of the pitch for it suggests one thing, and publishers or even interviewers want to sort of frame it in a certain way, like as salacious, or like, you know, I wrote about being a sex worker and an addict, and they were like, oh, you were victimized and you did sex work to pay for your addiction, you know. And part of the way that I've responded to that is just by you know, correcting it, because that isn't my story. I didn't do sex work to, you know, those were both sort of things that I chose to some extent when I was younger, and my experience was not that of like a hapless victim who needed to be saved. And I think part of it is resisting the familiar or like the sort of narrative that folks are looking for in a story that from superficially looks like it might offer that, and sort of disrupting that within the work. And, you know, another small way is like, you know, even with my first book, like, you know, 12 years ago, I would just always get questions about my experience and never questions about my work. And it was like, oh, what did it feel like to spank men? Or like, what did it feel like to have this experience? And I became really adept at just saying whatever it was I had actually come to say in answer to any question, like any sort of probing question about my personal life. I would be like, you know, that's funny. It really reminds me of a craft choice that I made, right? Or like the political underpinnings of this story and why I think it's important. And just to, you know, use that space to talk about whatever I want and to not always be reacting to other people's expectations.
Does that resonate with you at all, Alice? Or how do you feel that we can navigate that? That question.
Yeah, I guess when you're kind of you have an argument or like a point to make, and then you're also writing about your own experience, as we are, and we write personal essays. I guess that there's two things up for criticism, and they are embedded in each other when you write like this. So your argument, but also aspects of your identity, and I think that's where it is troublesome to me, you know, because some people are more in danger than others, depending on those aspects and those intersections. So yeah, I think, you know, yeah, with illness, we're encouraged to talk about ourselves maybe, but within that, how aspects of your identity intersect with your identity as a sick person or as a disabled person, you know, like that's a very large spectrum of people, and that, you know, yeah, I see that as, I find that quite troubling, because obviously we want to, you know, you hear personal stories from all aspects, from all people, you know.
Yeah.
Not just the, you know, against we have the dominant narrative, so we need to hear the, you know, our ones, but yeah,
it sounds,
that does trouble me personally.
I mean, it sounds from both of you like it's at least part of the way of handling it is by complicating things, by continuously complicating things, in terms of like the questions that you're willing to answer, and complicating those, but also complicating identity and refusing to sort of be siloed, I suppose. Speaking of which, in terms of being just reaching out and being inspired. So I thought I'd end it with another question from the audience, and that is a question from Sal, who said, Alice said that you can't speak pain, yes, but to me, your book did exactly that. Are there writers you or Melissa have turned to for that language or great writing on the personal? And I feel like that might be a nice final question about inspiration, I suppose, and drawing power out of other people.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I mentioned Adrian Rich in that early one, and that reading, sorry. And people like, I don't know, I think people write about personal things in different ways. Like Susan Sontag in her diaries, to me, is like a different person to in her essays and things like that. And she's like, she even says like, I'm making up who I am in this diary, like this isn't me, kind of thing. So there's a lot of like, yeah, I find the kind of spectrum of people's personal writing really interesting. Audre Lorde, and it's another person who I think is amazing at personal writing. And then lots of people in Melissa's book, like Nancy Meyers is amazing at.
She's so good.
Like, and yeah, so many people.
Yeah, those are the first two names that always come to mind when I'm asked a question like this, are Adrian Rich and Audre Lorde, because I think those were the first essayists that I read, and I thought, oh, like this is the work that writing about experience can do, right? That it can be overtly political, it can be using personal experience to work through an idea to galvanize other people. So I would say like those sort of feminist theorists and critical writers, and Sontag's diaries are my favorite work of hers, honestly. I mean, I like some of her critical essays, but her diaries are so fun. And I would say there's a lot of folks writing today. I was just on a panel, Alice, if you don't know these two books, they just came out in the US, and I'm sure that they're coming out in the UK. Megan O'Rourke's book called The Invisible Kingdom, really amazing work about chronic illness and sort of invisible illness. And Chloe Cooper Jones has a book about her that uses sort of her experience of having like very visible disability through the lens of sort of examining art all over the world and sort of thinking through beauty. And I think we're sort of living in a time where there's a lot of amazing work being done. So I can't read it fast enough, you know.
Brilliant. Oh, that I have to ask one more question before I finish. Because you sort of just brought it, because I asked you about music, Melissa, but also Alice, I mean, you've done quite extensive work with visual arts. Was there, I'll make this a very short question, was there any point where you considered using visuals in Ill Feelings?
Yeah, there was. There was, but I think it was more that I had these scraps of things that were visual, but I didn't have enough. So I had like this beautiful diagram that my mum made in therapy, I think, that was like a spider diagram of like everyone in her life and how she related to them. And a lot of those relationships were about how they thought about my illness, which was really interesting. So there was really nice visual, there was some really nice visual things, but there wasn't quite enough to, you know, have for every chapter, or, you know, I needed kind of more than I had. So in the end we chose no visuals, which I think is the right thing. But yeah, I think I would still like to, the work I'm kind of working towards now is probably going to have more visuals in it, I think.
That's exciting. Oh, that was just squeeze that in at the end. Thank you so much, both. We have to end, even though I've got like so many more questions, but I just urge you all who are watching to read these two amazing books, which are in some ways so very different, but also there's great affinity between them. And it's been an absolute pleasure to be able to have a space to speak about them in tandem and to speak about them at the same time together. So you can buy them on the Lighthouse website. This will also be available to watch afterwards. So if there's anyone who's interested, please tell them that they can watch it afterwards. And yeah, just to let you know that we will continue to do all our events hybrids, so that people, for greater access, so that people can watch them from wherever they are, as with this one. So thank you so much, and we're gonna stop recording there. Thank you so much, Alice and Melissa.